This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. It is a warm spring day in Fort Myers, Florida, in early May 2013. Two police officers stand on the stoop of a modest home, responding to a desperate welfare check call from a family halfway across the country. After days of unanswered phone calls and a gut feeling that something is horribly wrong, authorities have finally forced their way inside. As the front door swings open, a blast of frigid air pours out. The air conditioning has been set unnaturally low. The officer's eyes adjust to the dim light. All the curtains have been drawn shut. A fine layer of condensation clings to the inside of the windows, dripping slowly, a telltale sign that the cool air inside has been battling the Florida heat outside. The house is eerily silent. Carefully, the officers move from room to room through the tidy residence. Nothing seems obviously out of place at first glance. There are no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle. But a heavy sense of dread hangs in the air. In the hallway, one officer crinkles his nose. Despite the cold temperature, there's a faint, unmistakable odor of decay beginning to permeate. They follow the source of the smell to a bathroom at the end of the hall. Pushing open the bathroom door, the officers freeze at the sight before them. In the bathtub lies the lifeless body of a woman, submerged in murky water and blanketed by soaked towels. The woman's skin has turned pallid and is starting to show signs of severe decomposition, indicating that she has been dead for several days. The scene is as perplexing as it is horrifying. The towels covering her and the frosty air seem deliberately arranged to conceal her death, an apparent effort to mask any odor and delay discovery. In that chilling moment, the quiet suburban home officially becomes a crime scene. It's the day a devoted mother and friend is found dead under suspicious circumstances. This is the story of Laura Howard. Laura Howard was a 53-year-old mother of 3 adult children who had moved to Fort Myers, Florida to embrace a fresh start in her 50s. A retired Sunday school teacher, Laura had dedicated much of her life to her family and community. By 2013, she found herself enjoying a well-earned retirement in Florida's sunshine. She had relocated from out of state about 3 years prior, drawn by the warm climate and a chance to start a new chapter in life. In her new neighborhood in Fort Myers, Laura made friends easily. Neighbors would often see her at the local community pool, where she loved to relax. A neighbor later recalled that this cheerful, caring woman truly enjoyed the palm trees and sunshine. Despite the distance from her old hometown, Laura kept close ties with her family, speaking with her children often and visiting when she could. By spring 2013, Laura was looking forward to a visit from her son, Greg, who had planned a trip south to see her. She excitedly made plans for his stay. They talked about spending time outdoors and even renting a boat together. Family was everything to Laura, and Greg's upcoming visit had her in high spirits. However, in the weeks leading up to that trip, subtle signs of trouble began to surface. Laura's communications with her children became uncharacteristically erratic. At one point, Greg received a perplexing text from his mother's phone telling him, "Don't come down, I won't be here." A message that was completely at odds with her earlier excitement. Greg was baffled. The wording and tone of the message did not sound like his mom at all. Friends and family now believed that this message had not come from Laura at all, but from someone else using her phone as a ploy. It was a red flag that something was wrong, though at the time they could not imagine just how wrong. In the background of Laura Howard's life at the time was a relatively new acquaintance, a man who introduced himself as Simon Storm. Laura had met Storm in Fort Myers, and, being kind-hearted, she agreed to let him rent the spare room in her home. She told a friend that Simon would help her with some home repairs in exchange for lodging. By all accounts, Laura saw this as a mutually beneficial arrangement. She got some assistance around the house, and Simon Storm got an affordable place to stay. Some sources have described Simon as Laura's date or her boyfriend, while others frame him as a tenant/handyman. Regardless of the exact dynamic, Simon was living under Laura's roof in April 2013. Laura's family knew very little about this man. In fact, Greg later admitted that his mother had not shared much about Simon at all, and Greg had a strong feeling that she did not want Simon around during his upcoming visit. It seemed Laura intended to have a private, family-focused week with her son, free of any distractions or house guests. She even mentioned to Greg that Simon would not be staying at the house while he visited, which in hindsight suggests that she may have been trying to distance herself from Simon at around that time. Laura Howard's life was by all accounts full of love and optimism in early 2013. She had loving children, new friends, and a tranquil retirement ahead of her. Tragically, all of that was about to be shattered in the most horrifying way. The events that unfolded in late April 2013 would leave her family devastated and authorities launching an intense search for the truth about what happened inside that little Fort Myers home. By the third week of April, Laura Howard's family knew that something was amiss. Her son, Greg, arrived in Florida expecting to be greeted by his mother, but Laura never showed up at the airport to pick him up. Confused and concerned, Greg tried calling his mother's phone repeatedly. Her 3 children collectively called dozens of times, but each call went unanswered. There was a mix of worry and rationalization. Perhaps they thought Laura had a last-minute change of plans or an issue with her phone. But as hours turned to days with no word from her, the family's concern turned to panic. Laura's friends in Fort Myers were also alarmed. One close friend and neighbor, Sally, knew Laura was eagerly anticipating Greg's visit. When Greg knocked on Sally's door to ask if she had seen his mom, Sally's face went pale. She had not seen Laura either, and something did not feel right. By that weekend, Laura's daughter Cassandra and some other loved ones were frantic. Cassandra recalls calling her mother's phone and leaving a final urgent message. When no call came, the family contacted the Fort Myers police and reported Laura missing. Police officers initially visited Laura's home on April 26, 2013, to perform a welfare check. From the outside, everything appeared normal. The house was secure, there were no broken windows or obvious signs of foul play. Peering through the windows, officers could not see anything alarming. The curtains were drawn tightly and nothing screamed distress. With no immediate cause to force entry and no response to their knocks at the door, the officers left, noting that nothing seemed off at first glance. However, Laura's family and friends knew that her continued silence was deeply abnormal. They persisted, urging law enforcement to check again. Her daughter, Cassandra, increasingly desperate, even told police that she would fly down herself and break into the home if they did not act, her gut telling her that something was very wrong. Finally, 1 week later, on May 3, 2013, authorities returned to Laura's residence with a determination to get inside. By now, Laura had been missing all week, and worry had started to reach a fever pitch. This time, upon entering her home, police immediately sensed trouble. The house was unnaturally cold due to the air conditioner being set at the lowest possible temperature. Condensation was visible on the windows from the cold air meeting the humid Florida warmth. These details, though subtle at first, were unusual enough to put the officers on high alert as they moved through the home. What they found in the bathroom confirmed their worst fears. Laura Howard's decomposing body was discovered in the bathtub, water filling the tub up and covering her remains with layers of wet towels. Investigators at the scene were confronted with a grisly and perplexing situation. Laura had likely been dead for several days, as indicated by the advanced state of decomposition and the fact that she had to later be identified through dental records. The water in the tub and the cold indoor temperature had slowed the decomposition process somewhat, but not enough to preserve much evidence on her body. The medical examiner would later note that her cause of death was not immediately apparent due to the condition of her remains. In fact, investigators could not tell if she had been strangled, suffocated, or harmed in some other way. There were no obvious injuries and no sign of a struggle in the bathroom. The scene appeared oddly methodical. Whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to mask any odor or sign of decay, presumably to avoid alerting the neighbors. The air conditioning had been cranked down as low as possible, and investigators later observed that even moisture-absorbent towels had been placed around windows and under doors. likely an attempt to absorb leakage and block the smell of death from escaping the house. These deliberate actions told police right away that this was no accident, and also it wasn't a suicide. Someone had engineered the scene to buy time. With Laura's body found, the missing persons case became a homicide investigation. Detectives began processing the crime scene for clues. Notably, certain personal items were missing from the home, chief among them, Laura's vehicle from the driveway. Additionally, friends pointed out that her television was missing from the living room, which struck them as odd. These missing items suggested a possible theft or a burglary aspect to the case. However, the doors were found locked, and there were no signs of forced entry, raising the likelihood that Laura had willingly let someone into her home, or that the perpetrator already had keys. As investigators secured the scene, news of Laura's tragic death reached her family. The shock was devastating. A week of uncertainty gave way to heartbreak, and then to a single burning question: who could have done this to a kind, gentle retiree in her own home? Early suspicions quickly focused in on the one person in Laura's life who was notably missing in the aftermath: Simon Storm, the man who had been living with her. When police tried to locate this housemate, he was nowhere to be found. It did not escape investigators' notice that Simon's absence coincided with Laura's death, and that he had apparently left town with her vehicle. Almost immediately, Simon Storm became the prime person of interest in Laura Howard's death. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from the sponsors that support this show. From the moment that Laura Howard's body was discovered, Fort Myers police treated the case as a suspicious death likely involving foul play. The condition of the crime scene itself provided early clues. The intentional cooling of the house and covering of the body suggested that the perpetrator had knowledge of how to delay detection. Detectives theorized that whoever did this needed time to escape, or potentially establish an alibi. And indeed, as they dug into the timeline, it became clear that Laura had likely been killed around mid-April 2013, with her having last been seen alive on April 15th. The killer had likely gained at least a week's head start before her body was found. Investigators began piecing together Laura's final days through interviews and evidence. They learned that on April 15, 2013, Laura had spent time at the community pool. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive, according to a neighbor who spoke to police. After that date, Laura seemingly vanished from her normal routine. Family and friends recounted how communication from Laura suddenly stopped at around that time. The strange text message Greg received telling him not to visit, which the family now firmly believed was sent by someone else posing as Laura, came shortly after April 15th. This text, combined with Laura's failure to pick up Greg at the airport on April 20th and the subsequent phone silence, helped investigators narrow the likely time of her death to the week of April 15th through the 20th. Crucially, neighbors and friends provided disturbing anecdotes about Laura's housemate, the man known as Simon Storm, from that same week. One neighbor told police that Simon had approached them with an unusual offer. He was trying to sell Laura's television set, claiming that Laura had given him permission to do so. The neighbor found it odd. Why would Laura suddenly have her tenant sell off her belongings, and why wasn't she handling it herself? Even more alarming, when the neighbor expressed a desire to check in on Laura, since they had not seen her, Simon insisted that she was not feeling well and asked them not to disturb her. It appeared that Simon was actively trying to keep people away from Laura's home during the very period she was missing, and as it turns out, was likely already dead inside. Another piece of evidence was the content of text messages sent from Laura's phone during that week. Besides the "don't come here, I won't be around" text sent to her son Greg, there were a few other short messages Laura had supposedly sent to friends that did not sound like her usual texting style. It seemed likely that Simon, or whoever was responsible, had been using Laura's phone to send fake updates, attempting to create the illusion that she was still alive and traveling or busy. Investigators strongly suspected that these messages were part of a cover-up, meant to delay any alarm about Laura's disappearance. This aligns with what one detective later pointed out, indicating a deliberate effort to mislead everyone about when Laura really died, stating, "Most likely the killer had stolen Howard's phone and tried to cover up her time of death." With mounting evidence pointing to Simon Storm's involvement, the investigation's next step was to find this mysterious individual. But when police tried to track him down, Simon Storm had already vanished. They ran his name through databases and quickly hit a snag. Turns out, Simon Storm wasn't his real name. There were no reliable records of a man by that name matching his description. This was a significant turning point. It meant that not only was Storm likely Laura's killer, but he was also a con man who had been living under an alias. Detectives interviewed Laura's friends further and uncovered that Simon's behavior had been peculiar from the start. He had spun a sob story to Laura when they first met. Simon claimed he was an immigrant from Canada in the US illegally, and that he was on a quest to track down his ex-wife who had run off with their children. This tale apparently played on Laura's empathy, and might explain why she allowed him into her home. However, now the police had reason to believe that the story was entirely fabricated. Investigators did not have the Simon Storm name in any criminal databases, so they turned to some other clues. In Laura's house, they found a few items that might have belonged to the suspect. Possibly fingerprints, a forgotten piece of mail, or some personal paperwork left behind in his haste to escape. It has never been publicly detailed exactly what clues inside the house helped, but authorities eventually uncovered Simon Storm's true identity: Robert Keene. Keene was a 44-year-old Illinois native, decidedly not Canadian, with a checkered past. This revelation was chilling. The kind, trusting Laura Howard had unknowingly let a dangerous individual into her life. Armed with Keene's real name, detectives dug into his background and found some disturbing information. Decades earlier, as a teenager, Robert Keene had been charged in Illinois with attempted murder. In that 1986 case, a then 17-year-old Keene had brutally attacked someone. He eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of aggravated battery. This indicated a history of violence. Furthermore, over the years, Keene had amassed a reputation as a chameleon con artist, frequently changing his name and his stories. He had numerous aliases. Police would later compile a list of at least 5 fake names that he used, and he had a knack for telling elaborate lies about himself. For instance, besides the faux Canadian persona he had used on Laura, he had at times claimed to be a professor with multiple degrees, or a former military man, whatever suited his manipulation at the time. The emerging picture of Robert Keene was that of a serial grifter who targeted people, especially women, to exploit their resources or hospitality. With this information, investigators now viewed Laura's case in a new light. Keene likely preyed on Laura's generosity and then silenced her when she became an inconvenience or when he had gotten what he wanted. A possible motive began to coalesce. Perhaps Laura discovered something about his lies or intended to end their arrangement, especially since she seemingly wanted him gone before her son came to visit. This might have led to a confrontation. It's also possible that Keene's motive was primarily theft and self-preservation. By eliminating Laura, he could steal her car and valuables and escape without paying rent or facing questions. While exact motives remain speculative, what's clear is that Robert Keene had both the opportunity and the capacity for violence, given his presence in the home and his past record. Within days of the discovery of Laura's body, Fort Myers police announced that Robert Keene, or Simon Strong, was a person of interest in Laura Howard's death. They were careful with their language. Since the medical examiner had not pinpointed a cause of death, they stopped short of issuing a murder warrant at that time. Nonetheless, Keene was the only individual they were actively looking for in connection with the case. Police alerted other law enforcement agencies and began tracking Keene's trail of escape across Florida. Unbeknownst to them, Keene's movements after Laura's death were already generating incidents in other parts of the state, clues that would soon surface and corroborate his guilt. As the investigation pressed on, detectives collected every bit of evidence from Laura's home: towels, water samples, any DNA or fingerprints, and her abandoned car once it was found, hoping for forensic links to Keene. But the cunning preparation of the scene suggested that Robert Keene had been meticulous. He had likely worn gloves and left minimal trace evidence. Investigators also kept Laura's grieving family informed as best they could. For Greg, Cassandra, and the rest of Laura's family, it was incomprehensible that the friendly handyman their mother had described could be an alleged killer. The family channeled their grief into supporting the investigation, speaking to the media and urging anyone with knowledge of Keene's whereabouts to come forward. Within the first few weeks, local Crime Stoppers bulletins were issued featuring Keene's mugshot and aliases, and the case began to gain wider attention as a particularly heinous betrayal of trust. While the autopsy results on Laura Howard were ultimately inconclusive regarding exact cause of death, the circumstantial evidence of homicide was overwhelming. As one investigator bluntly put it, given the details surrounding the crime, it was likely a homicide, despite the lack of a clear forensic cause. Laura had no known medical conditions that could explain an accidental death in a bathtub, and it was virtually impossible that she would submerge herself and cover herself with towels. Everything pointed to someone else's hand. The case, now officially a homicide investigation, was heating up, and all roads led to Robert Keene, who was quickly proving to be a particularly elusive fugitive. By the time authorities identified Robert Keene as their suspect, a fuller picture of this elusive man began to emerge. Keene was born around 1969 and grew up in Illinois. Long before crossing paths with Laura, he had a history of criminal behavior and deception. In fact, investigators uncovered that Keene's trouble with the law began in his youth. At 17 years old, he was involved in a violent incident that led to an attempted murder charge. Though he avoided a long prison term by pleading down to aggravated battery, this early episode hinted at Keene's capacity for extreme violence, even at a young age. It's unclear what other crimes he may have committed in the ensuing years, but one thing became evident. Robert Keene reinvented himself many times, leaving a patchy trail that was hard to follow. Keene was, in essence, a con artist and a drifter. He used numerous aliases throughout his adult life, often to ingratiate himself with people and live under the radar. Among the false names he was known to use were Simon Storm, Simon Croft, Alex Deffrey, Alex Debble, and Alex Frost, in addition to some other variations. Each alias came with a new fabricated backstory. For example, as Laura's friends recounted, Simon Storm claimed to be a down-on-his-luck Canadian trying to reunite with his lost children. In other instances, Keene boasted of having been a university professor or a member of the Canadian Army, weaving elaborate and false details to gain sympathy or respect. He had a talent for telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. If someone was religious, he might emphasize his supposed wholesome background. If someone was generous, he would play up a tragic personal story to evoke pity. In Laura Howard's case, Robert Keene, as Simon Storm, exploited her kindness. He likely presented himself as helpful, polite, and in need of a break, persuading her to let him stay in her home. Laura's own friends noted that before she died, she mentioned her new tenant was going to assist with some home improvement projects, a prospect that Laura seemed pleased about. This shows how Keene inserted himself into her life under the guise of being useful to her. However, neighbors quickly felt that something wasn't right. The episode where Keene tried to sell off Laura's TV and urged neighbors not to contact her was deeply suspicious behavior. It revealed Keene's manipulative nature. He wanted material gain and control over information, classic tactics of an abuser or conman tightening his grip. Physically, Robert Keene did not appear especially intimidating. He was of short to average height, around 5'6", and had a stocky build, about 170 pounds. In 2013, at age 44, he had a receding hairline, was going bald on top, and often sported a dark mustache. His face, as seen in mugshots later released by police, is round with some unassuming features. The kind of person who might blend into a crowd easily. Keene likely relied on this ordinary appearance to avoid drawing suspicion, but there were a couple of distinctive quirks about him that people who met him would later recall. One particularly bizarre detail investigators shared is that Keene had an odd habit of asking women if he could give them a bath upon first getting to know them. This peculiar behavior, essentially a grooming tactic both literally and figuratively, was something Laura's family learned about only after her death. It's unsettling in hindsight, considering Laura was found in a bath. Though we cannot know if this habit played into the crime, it demonstrates Keene's fixation on putting women into vulnerable positions. Another noteworthy aspect of Keene's background is how well prepared and transient he was. By the time he met Laura, it seems Keene was already living off the grid to an extent. He avoided using his real identity, meaning no legitimate jobs, leases, or paper trails were in his own name. That made tracking him exceedingly difficult once he fled. Trish Rout, a Crime Stoppers coordinator, remarked on the challenge. When we're dealing with someone who is living off the grid, it's really difficult to find them, especially when he's using an alias that other people aren't questioning. Keene knew how to disappear. He had no known digital presence, and he used prepaid cell phones or alias accounts wherever possible. Authorities also learned that Keene might have targeted other women in the past in similar fashion. While Laura Howard's case is the one that brought him to national attention, investigators suspect that there could be additional victims or scams tied to Robert Keene that simply haven't been uncovered yet. As one detective cautioned, "We have no idea how many other victims are out there, past and present." This statement underscores the kind of person that police believe Keene is, a predator who could move from victim to victim, city to city, assuming new identities each time his welcome ran out or things got too dangerous for him. By all accounts, Robert Keene became the primary suspect in Laura's death as soon as her body was found and he was discovered missing. His means, motive, and opportunity were all evident. He had been alone with Laura in the critical window of time. He had a motive in that Laura might have been ending their arrangement or he wanted to steal from her, and he certainly had the means. As shown by his past, he was capable of violence, and cunning enough to stage the scene. Additionally, tangible evidence linked Keene to the crime. On the same day that Laura's body was found, police located her missing vehicle, and uncovered documents tying back to Robert Keene, as we'll touch on in just a moment. All of this elevated Keene from a mere person of interest to the fugitive suspect at the center of the investigation. More after the break. As detectives worked the case in Fort Myers, Robert Keene was already on the run. Tracing his whereabouts after Laura's murder became a top priority. The first big break came within 24 hours of discovering Laura's body. Her silver Toyota was found abandoned in another part of Florida. Specifically, it turned up on Florida's east coast, roughly 120 miles away, in the city of Margate. It wasn't a coincidence. Margate police had, just days earlier, responded to a disturbance at a private home that would turn out to be directly connected to Robert Keene. In Margate, an older woman had allowed a man renting a room in her home to stay for a short period, a man who went by yet another alias. Reports vary which one, but it was likely one of Keene's known fake names. This scenario sounded alarmingly familiar. According to a Margate police incident report, the woman had grown suspicious of her new boarder, Simon, particularly after hearing about a wanted suspect on the news. When her brother confronted the man and asked to see his identification, the boarder agreed and said he would go retrieve it from upstairs. What happened next could have been ripped from a movie. Instead of coming back down with an ID, the man leapt out of a second-story window and fled, literally jumping from the house to escape. He ran off so quickly that he left almost all of his personal belongings behind. By the time Margate authorities put two and two together, the fleeing boarder was identified as Robert Keene, and the possessions he abandoned were a treasure trove of evidence. Inside the room he had occupied were duffel bags containing documents linked to Laura Howard. In fact, among the items Keene left were Laura's own passport, her driver's license, and even an old marriage certificate of hers. Finding Laura's personal papers in Keene's bag powerfully connected him to her death. It suggested that after killing Laura, or discovering her deceased, in the unlikely scenario someone else was involved, Keene raided her home for important papers and identification, perhaps with an eye towards stealing her identity or keeping mementos. He also left behind some of his fake IDs and documents under his aliases, helping police catalog his various personas. The Margate incident occurred sometime in late April or early May 2013, and Keene was last physically seen during that dramatic escape from the second-floor window. One report from detectives indicates that as late as June 2013, a sighting of Keene corresponds to that Margate flight. Some sources cite June, others May, but either way, that was the final confirmed sighting. After that, Robert Keene seems to have vanished into thin air. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement launched a manhunt for Robert Keene. Given the interstate nature of the crime, he wasn't a Florida native. Federal authorities like the U.S. Marshals Service were alerted. Wanted posters were disseminated, describing Keene's appearance and aliases. Police believed that Keene might try to blend into another community by targeting a new victim or family. As a result, they warned the public, especially in Florida, about his tactics. One unsettling pattern investigators highlighted was that Keene often ingratiated himself with single women or women around his age who might have a spare room, just as he had done with Laura and the woman in Margate, Florida. The public was cautioned. If a man with a hard luck story and one of several alias names tried to rent a room or offer handyman services, be extremely wary and check his background. Leads have since poured in sporadically. Over the years since 2013, there have been periodic tips and alleged sightings of Robert Keene, but none have panned out conclusively. Sometimes someone would call saying that they met a man who gave a fake-sounding history, or used one of Keene's alias surnames. Task force officers would investigate, only to find it was a dead end, or another person entirely. Keene seemingly became an expert at disappearing, potentially taking on totally new aliases not yet known to authorities. It's believed that he stayed largely in Florida for some time, given his familiarity with the area and possibly some contacts or other victims there. In fact, early on, police speculated that Keene could still be hiding somewhere in Florida, living off the grid under a false identity. With Florida's many transient populations and seasonal residents, it isn't hard to disappear into certain communities if one is careful. One challenge has been that Robert Keene has not been formally charged with murder, meaning that there wasn't initially a nationwide murder warrant, only warrants related to questioning, car theft, and fraud. However, authorities did try to make it clear that he was the sole suspect in Laura's death. Over time, as evidence accumulated, it's possible that stronger warrants were obtained, but publicly the case is still often phrased as Keene being wanted for questioning in the homicide. This phrasing aside, law enforcement's intent is clear. They want Robert Keene in custody and fully expect to charge him once caught. Years have passed now without Robert Keene being found. By 2021, the case had gone somewhat cold, leading Laura's family and detectives to try a new avenue: national media. In August of that year, an episode of Investigation Discovery's In Pursuit with John Walsh featured Laura Howard's unsolved murder and spotlighted Robert Keene as a fugitive. The show's exposure brought a renewed flurry of tips. John Walsh's team highlighted Keene's known aliases and even mentioned his unusual bath habit, hoping that someone somewhere might have encountered him. The episode reiterated that Keene, then age 52, was still at large 8 years after the crime and encouraged viewers to call with any information. Unfortunately, even with a national audience, Keene remained elusive. As of the latest updates, now over a decade since Laura's death, Robert Keene has not been captured. The manhunt quietly endures in the background of law enforcement operations. Detectives periodically check old aliases against new records. For instance, monitoring if any Simon Storm or Alex Frost pops up in public databases like driver's licenses or arrest logs. They've scoured leads in multiple states. There is a persistent belief among some investigators that Keene may have changed his name yet again and assimilated into another community, possibly even outside of Florida. Others think he could be living off of cash jobs and avoiding any official paperwork that would trip up databases. Robert Keene's ability to remain undetected for so long suggests a combination of careful planning, luck, and perhaps help from unknown associates or simply the anonymity afforded by drifting through society's margins. Law enforcement has publicly stated that they will not stop looking for Keene. Investigators in Fort Myers have kept his file open and regularly circulate his information to other agencies. They are unequivocal that they consider him dangerous. As a Crime Stoppers representative grimly noted, "You don't just leave a woman dead and then jump out of a second-story building to avoid being caught if you've done nothing wrong." In their view, Robert Keene is likely responsible for Laura's death and possibly other crimes we may never know about. Today, Robert Keene is officially a wanted fugitive, and his case is listed among Southwest Florida's notable unsolved crimes. He would now be in his mid-50s, perhaps grayer and heavier than the last known photos of him show. But until he is found, the question of justice for Laura Howard remains painfully unanswered. Laura Howard's life was senselessly cut short, robbing her of the joyful retirement and family moments that she had ahead of her. In the aftermath, her children and other loved ones have been left to grapple not only with grief, but with the agonizing lack of closure. They have tried their best to preserve her memory, remembering Laura as a devoted mother, a faithful friend, and a compassionate soul who opened her home to someone she thought was in need. The horror of how that kindness was repaid is something they continue to carry. 12 years later, the case remains open. Laura's family has not given up their quest for justice. Her son Greg, voicing the family's frustration and desire for answers, said, "He left her in a bathtub to rot. Either he's really good at hiding, or we're not looking hard enough." Authorities, too, remain determined to find Robert Keene. Each passing year is a reminder that a killer, or at least a man with crucial answers, is still out there, living free while Laura's family waits. Investigators regularly appeal to the public for assistance, emphasizing that no tip is too small to check out. Crime Stoppers of Southwest Florida continue to publicize Keene's face and information. Anyone with information about his whereabouts or aliases is urged to call the 24-hour hotline at 1-800-780-TIPS. That's 1-800-780-8477. Tips can be given anonymously, and rewards may be available for information leading to his location. In memory of Laura Howard, her family has also become vocal in raising awareness about the dangers of fraudsters and the importance of background checks on individuals entering one's life. They know that nothing will bring Laura back, but a measure of peace could come from seeing the person responsible held accountable. Until Robert Keene is found, the story of Laura Howard's unsolved murder endures as a cautionary tale, a reminder of both the fragility of trust and the tenacity of a family's love seeking justice. Laura's voice may have been silenced, but those who loved her continue to speak on her behalf, ensuring that her case is not forgotten. They, along with law enforcement, ask that anyone who recognizes Robert Keene or has heard someone tell a suspicious similar life story to the ones described, to please step forward. It is a solemn hope that with the public's vigilance and help, one day Robert Keene will be captured, answering at last for what happened in that quiet Fort Myers home so many years ago. Until such a time, the story of Laura Howard will remain unresolved.